Welcome back to Crime Vault. I'm your host, and today I'm sharing with you three of the most disturbing cases of infidelity that I've personally investigated and documented over my years covering true crime. These aren't just stories about cheating. These are stories about deception so elaborate, betrayals so profound, that they destroyed lives and left communities in shock. What you're about to hear involves a devoted wife who discovered her husband's double life through a single photograph, a religious community torn apart by their trusted leader's deadly secrets, and a love triangle that revealed a pattern of psychological predation spanning years. I've spent months researching these cases, interviewing survivors, and piecing together the truth from court records, police files, and personal testimonies. Tonight, I'm sharing these stories with you because they reveal something important about human nature and the lengths people will go to maintain their lies. But before we dive into these chilling accounts, I want to thank each and every one of you who watch Crime Vault. Your support means everything to me and allows me to continue bringing you these in-depth investigations. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider hitting that subscribe button. It really helps encourage me to keep digging into these important cases and sharing them with you. Your engagement is what keeps Crime Vault alive. Now let's begin with a case that still haunts me months after I first learned about it. The first case I want to share with you takes place in Denver, Colorado, and it's one that made me question everything I thought I knew about how well we can truly know another person. I first heard about this story through a contact at the Denver Police Department, and what started as a simple domestic dispute report became one of the most elaborate deception cases I've ever encountered. Sarah Chen was 34 years old when her world collapsed on March 15, 2019. She had been married to David Chen for 12 years. What everyone, including Sarah herself, considered a perfect marriage. Sarah worked as a marketing executive for a tech company, while David was a software engineer who traveled frequently for work. They had chosen not to have children, focusing instead on their careers and what appeared to be a deeply loving relationship. When I spoke with Sarah's friends and family members during my investigation, they all said the same thing. David and Sarah were relationship goals. They were that couple everyone envied. The ones who still held hands after 12 years of marriage, who posted loving messages to each other on social media, who never seemed to fight. David's job required him to travel about twice a month, sometimes for a week at a time. Sarah never questioned these trips. She trusted her husband completely. And David always called her every night, sent photos from his hotel rooms, and brought back small gifts from whatever city he claimed to be visiting. But on that March evening, everything changed with a single click of a mouse. Sarah was organizing their digital photos on their shared laptop, something she did every few months to keep their files organized. She was moving pictures from David's work folder to their personal albums when she noticed a subfolder she'd never seen before. It was buried deep in his work directory and simply labeled Denver Project. Now, this wouldn't normally be suspicious. David worked on many projects, but something made Sarah curious enough to open it. Maybe it was intuition. Maybe it was just random chance. But that single decision changed her life forever. The first photo she saw showed David standing in a park with a woman and two young children. The woman was brunette, petite, probably in her early 30s. The children, a boy and a girl, looked to be around 6 and 8 years old. David had his arm around the woman, and they were all smiling at the camera like a family. Sarah stared at that photo for several minutes, trying to rationalize what she was seeing. Maybe these were colleagues and their children. Maybe David was at some company, family event. But as she scrolled through more photos, that rationalization became impossible to maintain. There were dozens of photos spanning what appeared to be several years. David and this woman at restaurants, holding hands. David helping the little boy ride a bicycle. The woman wearing what looked like an engagement ring, then later a wedding band. Photos from what appeared to be birthday parties, Christmas mornings, school events. The timestamps on these photos told a story that made Sarah's blood run cold. They went back 7 years. 7 years of this parallel life, documented in digital images that David had apparently forgotten were stored on their shared computer. But what really broke Sarah's heart were the photos of the children, because when she looked closely, she could see David's features in their faces. The boy had David's nose and smile. The girl had his dark eyes and the same way of tilting her head when she laughed. These weren't just photos of David with another woman. These were photos of David with his other family. Instead of immediately confronting David, Sarah made a decision that surprised even her. She decided to investigate. Over the next 3 weeks, while David was away on what he claimed was a business trip to Chicago, Sarah became a detective in her own life. She started with their credit card statements, something she'd never scrutinized before since they kept separate accounts and split household expenses. What she found was damning. Charges for restaurants she'd never been to, hotels in cities David claimed he'd never visited, purchases at toy stores and children's clothing shops. She found the lease for a second apartment in David's name, in a suburb about 20 miles from their home. She discovered that many of David's business trips corresponded with school holidays and events in the local school district where this apartment was located. Through careful social media investigation, skills I taught her during one of our phone conversations, Sarah identified the woman as Jennifer Martinez, a nurse at Denver General Hospital. Jennifer's Facebook profile told the story of a single mother raising 2 children, frequently posting about her wonderful partner David, who helped with school events and family activities, but who traveled for work and therefore didn't appear in many public photos. The most heartbreaking discovery came when Sarah realized that Jennifer had no idea Sarah existed. In Jennifer's world, David was her devoted partner who was simply private about social media. Sarah found posts where Jennifer referred to David's business partner Sarah, who he traveled with frequently. Sarah realized she had been relegated to a fictional work colleague in this other life. By the time David returned from his latest business trip, Sarah had compiled a complete dossier at his double life. She had addresses, names, school records for the children, and even Jennifer's work schedule. She knew about soccer practices and piano lessons, about parent-teacher conferences and family vacations, but Sarah wasn't ready to confront David yet. First, she needed to contact Jennifer. The conversation between Sarah and Jennifer, which I've reconstructed from both women's accounts, was surreal. Sarah called Jennifer at work, introduced herself as David's wife, and Jennifer's first response was confusion. Not anger, but genuine confusion. "I think you're mistaken," Jennifer said. "David isn't married. We've been together for 7 years. We're planning our wedding." "Jennifer," Sarah said, "I need you to sit down. David and I have been married for 12 years. I'm looking at photos of you and your children right now." What followed was a 3-hour phone conversation where 2 women compared their lives and realized they had both been living with the same man, a man who had created completely separate identities to maintain relationships with both of them. David told Jennifer that Sarah was his business partner, someone he had to travel with for work but who meant nothing to him personally. He told Sarah that his frequent absences were for career advancement and that he was working toward a promotion that would allow him to travel less. Both women had been planning futures with this man. Both had been completely deceived. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was unlike anything either woman had expected. They decided to confront David together, and Sarah invited Jennifer to their home. When David returned from what he claimed was a client meeting, but which Jennifer knew was actually a trip to see Sarah. When David walked into their living room and saw both Sarah and Jennifer sitting on the couch, his face went through a series of expressions that Sarah described to me as like watching someone's entire world collapse in real time. His first instinct was to lie. He claimed Jennifer was a delusional client who had become obsessed with him. Then he claimed Sarah was having a mental breakdown and imagining things. But faced with photos, documents, and the testimony of both women, his elaborate house of cards fell apart. What emerged during that confrontation was the full scope of David's deception. He had been maintaining 2 complete identities for almost 8 years. He had 2 phones, 2 sets of friends, 2 social media accounts under slightly different variations of his name. He had convinced Jennifer that Sarah was just a work colleague, and convinced Sarah that Jennifer didn't exist at all. The financial cost of maintaining 2 lives had put David deep in debt, which explains some inconsistencies Sarah had noticed in their finances. He had taken out loans and credit cards that Sarah knew nothing about, all to fund his double life. But perhaps most devastating was the emotional cost. David had 2 children who believed he was their father figure, a woman who thought she was planning a wedding to the love of her life, and a wife who had trusted him completely for over a decade. The aftermath of this revelation destroyed multiple lives. Sarah filed for divorce immediately. Jennifer had to explain to her children why David would no longer be part of their lives. David lost his job when the story became public, partly because of the financial irregularities, but also because his company couldn't trust someone who had lived such an elaborate lie. During the divorce proceedings, even more deceptions came to light. David had been skimming money from joint accounts to support his double life. He had forged Sarah's signature on financial documents. He had even taken out a life insurance policy on Sarah without her knowledge, naming himself as the beneficiary. When I last spoke with Sarah about 6 months ago, she was still recovering from the trauma of discovering that her entire marriage had been built on lies. She's in therapy, has moved to a different city, and is slowly learning to trust again. She told me that the hardest part wasn't the betrayal itself, but the realization that she had been living with a complete stranger for 12 years. Jennifer is raising her children as a single mother and has been honest with them about what happened, explaining in age-appropriate terms that sometimes adults make very bad choices that hurt the people who love them. As for David, the last I heard he was living alone, had declared bankruptcy, and was working in a different field under a different name. The elaborate web of lies that had sustained him for nearly a decade had left him with nothing. No family, no career, no relationships, and no credibility. This case taught me something important about the nature of deception. David wasn't just cheating, he was living multiple complete lives, maintaining entirely separate identities with surgical precision. The level of planning and compartmentalization required to sustain such deception for so long suggests a psychological profile that goes far beyond typical infidelity. But what haunts me most about this case is how easily it could have gone on forever. If Sarah hadn't randomly clicked on that folder, if David had been more careful about where he stored those photos, two families might still be living the same lie today. It makes you wonder, how many other David Chengs are out there, living double lives with such skill that no one suspects? How many families are built on foundations of deception, so elaborate that the truth may never surface? That first case still gives me chills every time I think about it. The idea that someone could maintain such elaborate deception for so long, affecting so many lives, is almost incomprehensible. But unfortunately, David Chen's story isn't unique. Before I continue with our next case, I want to hear from you. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted was living a double life? Have you experienced that moment when you realized everything you thought you knew about someone was wrong? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your experiences help others feel less alone when facing similar betrayals. Now, our second case is even more disturbing because it involves not just personal betrayal, but the corruption of an entire community's trust. This is a story about how faith itself can be weaponized for deception and how betrayal can literally become deadly. The second case I want to share with you takes us to Millbrook, Pennsylvania, a small town where I spent several weeks last year investigating one of the most shocking betrayals I've ever encountered. This isn't just a story about infidelity, it's about how two people used an entire community's faith to hide their crimes and how their deception ultimately led to murder. Millbrook is the kind of town that feels frozen in time. Population just under 4,000, one main street with local businesses that have been family-owned for generations, and the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business. At the center of this community was the Millbrook Community Church, a modest building that had served the town's spiritual needs for over 60 years. For 15 years, Pastor Michael Harrison had been the moral compass of this community. He was 43 years old, married to his college sweetheart, Ruth, for 18 years, and together they had built what everyone considered an exemplary Christian life. Michael was the kind of pastor who remembered everyone's names, who showed up at hospital bedsides without being asked, who counseled troubled couples and helped struggling families. When I first arrived in Millbrook to investigate this case, person after person told me the same thing about Michael Harrison. He was a man of God, someone they trusted completely, someone who had never given them any reason to doubt his integrity. But Michael Harrison was living a lie that would eventually cost someone their life. The other central figure in our story is Elena Vasquez, who served as the church's choir director and music coordinator. Elena was 38, married to Carlos, a mechanic who owned a small auto repair shop in town. Elena had a beautiful soprano voice and had transformed the church's music program, organizing concerts and special events that brought the community together. From the outside, both the Harrisons and the Vasquez family appeared to be pillars of the community. But what no one knew was that Michael and Elena had been having an affair for over 3 years, and they had turned their positions of trust into the perfect cover for their deception. The affair began, according to my investigation, during a church retreat in the mountains in 2018. Both Michael and Elena were there with their spouses, leading worship sessions and organizing activities for the congregation. But late one evening, while their spouses were asleep, Michael and Elena found themselves alone by the retreat center's fireplace. What started as a conversation about church business became something more intimate. Both later claimed they were going through difficult periods in their marriages. Michael said he felt unappreciated by Ruth. Elena claimed Carlos had become distant and focused only on his business. That night, they crossed a line that would eventually destroy multiple families and end with murder. But what makes this case so disturbing isn't just that a pastor and choir director were having an affair. It's how they used their positions of spiritual authority to hide their crimes and manipulate the very people who trusted them most. As pastor and choir director, Michael and Elena had legitimate reasons to meet privately, to travel together for conferences, and to spend hours planning services and events. Their affair was disguised as ministry work, hidden in plain sight of an entire congregation. They developed an elaborate system for their secret meetings. Elena would schedule choir practice when she knew Carlos would be working late. Michael would arrange counseling sessions that were actually opportunities to be alone with Elena. They used church conferences and retreats as opportunities for romantic getaways, all funded by the congregation's donations. But the most manipulative aspect of their deception was how they used faith itself as a weapon against their spouses. When Ruth began questioning Michael's frequent late nights and weekend church activities, Michael would remind her that ministry required sacrifice and that a good Christian wife should support her husband's calling. When Carlos wondered why Elena was spending so much time away from home, she would make him feel guilty for not supporting her service to God. They weaponized devotion, turning their spouse's faith against them to maintain their affair. For over 2 years, this system worked perfectly. Michael and Elena were able to conduct their relationship while maintaining their reputations as devoted spouses and spiritual leaders. But affairs, especially elaborate ones, require resources, and that's where our story takes an even darker turn. By 2020, Michael and Elena weren't just stealing time from their families, they were stealing money from their church. It started small. Michael would authorize purchases for church supplies that were actually gifts for Elena. Elena would submit receipts for music equipment that was never delivered to the church. But as their relationship intensified, so did their theft. They opened a joint bank account using the church's tax identification number. They rented an apartment across town, listing it as a church office for counseling services that never took place. They even purchased a car claiming it was for youth ministry transportation. Over 18 months, Michael and Elena embezzled over $47,000 from the Millbrook Community Church, but they weren't just stealing money, they were stealing from people who had donated that money out of faith, people who trusted them to use those funds for God's work. The person who discovered their theft was Dorothy McKenzie, the church's volunteer treasurer. Dorothy was 67 years old, a retired bookkeeper who had been managing the church's finances for over 20 years. She was meticulous, honest, and took her responsibilities seriously. Dorothy first noticed small discrepancies in the accounts in early 2021. A few $100s here and there that didn't match the receipts. Michael provided. At first she assumed these were honest mistakes. Michael was busy with pastoral duties, and small errors were understandable. But Dorothy was thorough, and as she dug deeper into the financial records, she began to see a pattern. Money was being transferred to accounts she didn't recognize. Purchases were being made for items that never appeared at the church. Bills were being paid for services that the church wasn't receiving. When Dorothy approached Michael with her concerns, his response should have been the first red flag. Instead of welcoming her diligence or offering to help clarify the discrepancies, Michael became defensive. He told Dorothy that she was overstepping her boundaries, that financial decisions were his responsibility as pastor, and that questioning church leadership showed a lack of faith. But Dorothy wasn't intimidated. She had been keeping books longer than Michael had been preaching, and she knew the difference between honest mistakes and deliberate fraud. Dorothy's investigation revealed the full scope of Michael and Elena's deception. She discovered the secret bank account, the apartment rental, the car purchase, and dozens of smaller fraudulent transactions. She also found records that revealed the pattern of Michael and Elena's meetings, travels, and suspicious activities. But most importantly, Dorothy discovered what Michael and Elena were planning to do with the stolen money. Hidden in Michael's computer files that Dorothy accessed while investigating the financial discrepancies, she found evidence that Michael and Elena were planning to disappear together. They had been researching cities in other states, looking into new identities, and planning what amounted to an elaborate escape plan. The plan was scheduled for November 2021. Michael was going to announce that he had received a calling to do missionary work overseas. Elena was going to claim that her marriage was ending and that she needed to move away to start fresh. They would leave Millbrook together, taking the church's building fund, over $80,000 that the congregation had been saving for renovations, and start new lives somewhere else. Their plan required eliminating the one person who had discovered their crimes and could expose them before they could escape. That person was Dorothy McKenzie. On October 15, 2021, Dorothy was found dead in her home. The initial police report classified it as a home invasion robbery, gone wrong. Dorothy's front door had been forced open, Her house had been ransacked, and her purse was missing. But Detective Maria Santos, who caught the case, noticed several things that didn't fit the robbery narrative. Dorothy's television, computer, and jewelry were untouched. Her car keys were still on the kitchen counter. Most importantly, the only thing that appeared to be missing from Dorothy's home office were her church financial records. Detective Santos had worked enough crime scenes to know that burglars don't typically target elderly women's bookkeeping files. The investigation that followed exposed Michael and Elena's crimes and ultimately led to their arrests for first-degree murder. The evidence showed that they had planned Dorothy's death carefully, staging it to look like a random crime while eliminating the witness who could destroy their escape plan. Phone records showed that Michael and Elena had been in contact the day of Dorothy's murder, despite both claiming they barely knew each other outside of church activities. Financial records proved they had been stealing from the church for years. And most damning, investigators found the draft of Dorothy's report to the church board, a report that detailed every aspect of their fraud and was scheduled to be presented 3 days after her death. The trial that followed tore the Millbrook community apart. Members of the congregation had to confront the fact that their spiritual leaders had not only betrayed their trust, but had murdered one of their most devoted members to cover up their crimes. Michael Harrison and Elena Vasquez were both convicted of first-degree murder and multiple counts of fraud. They're currently serving life sentences without the possibility of parole. But the damage they caused extends far beyond their prison sentences. The Millbrook Community Church never recovered from the scandal. Attendance dropped dramatically, donations dried up, and the building that had served the community for 60 years was eventually sold to pay legal bills and restitution. Ruth Harrison and Carlos Vasquez both had to rebuild their lives from nothing. Not only had they lost their spouses, but they discovered that their marriages had been shams for years. Both families lost their homes, their savings, and their standing in the community. The congregation members felt betrayed not just by Michael and Elena, but by their own faith. Many told me they struggled to trust any religious leader after discovering how completely they had been deceived. When I spoke with some of Millbrook's residents during my investigation, they all expressed the same sentiment. They felt like fools. They had trusted these people completely, had defended them against any hint of criticism, and had been manipulated by the very people who were supposed to guide them spiritually. Then Dorothy Mackenzie's family established a foundation in her memory to help other small organizations detect financial fraud. They want her death to serve as a warning about how trusted leaders can abuse their positions for personal gain. This case taught me something profound about the nature of betrayal. Michael and Elena didn't just cheat on their spouses, they betrayed an entire community's faith. They took the most sacred trust people can place in others and perverted it for their own selfish desires. But what's perhaps most chilling about this case is how close Michael and Elena came to getting away with it. If Dorothy Mackenzie hadn't been so thorough, if she hadn't been brave enough to stand up to intimidation, these two could have disappeared with the church's money and left their families and congregation to pick up the pieces. It makes you wonder how many other trusted leaders are abusing their positions right now, hiding behind faith and respectability, while destroying the lives of people who trust them. The Millbrook case haunts me because it shows how betrayal can destroy not just individuals but entire communities. When we trust someone with our most sacred beliefs, their betrayal cuts deeper than any personal wound. But our final case is different. It's about what happens when betrayal becomes obsession, when someone's need to control others becomes so consuming that they're willing to destroy multiple lives to maintain their power. This last case involves psychological manipulation so severe that it changed stalking laws in multiple states. If you're easily disturbed by descriptions of psychological abuse, you might want to skip ahead. But if you want to understand how dangerous obsession can become, this story will show you just how far some people will go when they believe they own another person's life. The third and final case I'm sharing with you today is perhaps the most disturbing because it reveals how some people turn relationships into hunting grounds, systematically targeting and destroying others for their own psychological gratification. This is the story of Jake Morrison, and it's a case that changed how I think about the difference between infidelity and predation. I first learned about this case through Dr. Amanda Foster, a pediatric surgeon from Seattle, who contacted me after hearing about my work on psychological manipulation cases. Amanda's story was so shocking that I initially had trouble believing it, until I began investigating and discovered that she was just one victim in a pattern of abuse that spanned over a decade. Amanda was 31 when she met Jake Morrison at a charity gala in Seattle in 2018. She was at the peak of her career, having just been promoted to head of pediatric surgery at Seattle Children's Hospital. She was confident, successful, and had never had trouble maintaining healthy relationships. Jake was 29, charming and successful in his own right as the founder of a promising software startup. He was exactly the kind of man Amanda thought she was looking for: ambitious, intelligent, and apparently completely devoted to her. Their courtship was a whirlwind romance that seemed almost too good to be true. Jake would surprise her at work with elaborate flower arrangements. He planned weekend getaways to romantic destinations. He remembered every detail of their conversations and seemed to anticipate her every need. Amanda's friends were initially impressed by Jake's attention and devotion. He seemed like the perfect boyfriend: attentive without being clingy, successful without being arrogant, romantic without being overwhelming. But what Amanda and her friends didn't realize was that Jake's behavior wasn't romantic devotion. It was reconnaissance. From their very first date, Jake was studying Amanda, cataloging her habits, preferences, fears, and vulnerabilities. He was building a psychological profile that he would later use to control every aspect of her life. The control began subtly, as it always does with skilled manipulators. Jake started suggesting that Amanda's work schedule was too demanding, that she was sacrificing her personal life for her career. He began showing up at the hospital unexpectedly, claiming he was just being supportive but actually monitoring her activities. Jake convinced Amanda to share her passwords and phone access, saying that couples should have no secrets from each other. He installed tracking apps on her devices, claiming it was for safety reasons since she worked late hours. He gradually inserted himself into every aspect of her life, always with explanations that seemed reasonable and caring. Within 6 months, Jake had essentially taken over Amanda's social calendar. He would make plans for them without consulting her, then act hurt if she had other commitments. He began isolating her from friends, always with seemingly valid reasons. Her friends were jealous of their relationship. They were bad influences. They didn't understand their love. Amanda later told me that the isolation happened so gradually she didn't recognize it was happening. Jake never forbade her from seeing friends or family. Instead, he made every social interaction so unpleasant or complicated that it became easier to just stay home with him. By their first anniversary, Jake had convinced Amanda to move in with him, combine their finances, and essentially structure her entire life around his needs and schedule. But Amanda was starting to feel suffocated, though she couldn't quite articulate why. Jake had an answer for every concern Amanda raised. When she said she felt isolated, he reminded her that he was all she needed. When she said she missed her independence, he pointed out how much happier she was now that she didn't have to worry about making decisions alone. When she said she felt like she was losing herself, he convinced her that she was actually becoming the best version of herself. But the psychological manipulation was just the beginning of Jake's deception. The breaking point came when Amanda discovered that Jake wasn't just controlling her, he was simultaneously pursuing another woman. Dr. Lisa Park was a colleague of Amanda's at the hospital, and Amanda discovered Jake's involvement with her in the most shocking way possible. Amanda had gone to Lisa's office to discuss a patient case when she noticed a photograph on Lisa's desk, a picture of Lisa with a man who looked exactly like Jake, taken at what appeared to be a romantic dinner. When Amanda asked about the photo, Lisa smiled and said it was her boyfriend Jake, whom she'd been dating for 8 months. The conversation that followed was surreal. Lisa described her relationship with Jake in terms that were almost identical to Amanda's experience: the whirlwind romance, the constant attention, the gradual isolation from friends and family. But Lisa believed she was Jake's only girlfriend, just as Amanda had believed she was his only girlfriend. When Amanda told Lisa that she had been living with Jake for over a year, Lisa's first reaction was disbelief. But as the two women compared their experiences, a horrifying picture emerged. Jake had been maintaining parallel relationships with both women, using the same manipulation tactics, telling them similar lies, and keeping them both isolated enough that they never suspected each other's existence. But the most chilling discovery came when Amanda and Lisa realized that their relationships with Jake followed an almost identical script. He had given them similar gifts, taken them to the same restaurants, even used the same romantic gestures and phrases. It was as if he was following a manual for psychological manipulation. The two women decided to investigate further, and what they discovered changed both of their lives forever. Jake Morrison had a history of targeting successful, independent women, isolating them through psychological manipulation, and then discarding them when they became too difficult to control. Through social media research and private investigator work that I helped coordinate, they identified at least 6 other women who had experienced similar relationships with Jake over the past 8 years. The pattern was always the same. He would target women who were successful in their careers, overwhelm them with attention and romance, gradually isolate them from their support networks, and then systematically break down their independence and self-confidence. What made Jake particularly dangerous was his ability to adapt his approach to each victim's specific vulnerabilities. With Amanda, he focused on her dedication to her work and convinced her that their relationship should be her priority. With Lisa, he targeted her insecurities about work-life balance and convinced her that he was helping her achieve happiness. But Jake's manipulation went beyond just emotional abuse. The investigation revealed that he had been systematically documenting his control over these women, keeping detailed records of their daily activities, their psychological responses to his manipulation, and their increasing dependence on him. In Jake's computer files, investigators found what amounted to a predator's handbook, detailed profiles of each woman he had targeted, strategies for breaking down their resistance, and methods for maintaining control. He had turned psychological abuse into a systematic process. The most disturbing discovery was Jake's long-term planning. He didn't just target these women randomly. He researched them extensively before making contact, identifying their vulnerabilities and crafting his approach specifically to exploit their psychological weaknesses. When Amanda and Lisa finally confronted Jake, his response revealed the true depth of his pathology. Instead of showing remorse or attempting to explain his behavior, Jake became enraged that his victims had discovered each other and disrupted his control. Jake's reaction to being exposed was to escalate his harassment of both women. He began following them, sending threatening messages, and attempting to sabotage their careers by spreading false rumors to their colleagues. When they obtained restraining orders, he violated them repeatedly. The legal case that followed revealed the full extent of Jake's predatory behavior. Prosecutors charged him with multiple counts of stalking, harassment, identity theft, and fraud. The evidence showed that Jake had been using information stolen from his victims to open credit accounts, access their personal records, and monitor their activities, even after their relationships ended. During the trial, 6 other women came forward with similar experiences. Each had been targeted by Jake using the same systematic approach, and each had been left psychologically devastated when he eventually discarded them. The prosecutor described Jake Morrison as one of the most dangerous psychological predators she had ever encountered. Unlike typical domestic abusers who act out of anger or jealousy, Jake appeared to abuse women for the psychological satisfaction of control itself. Jake was ultimately sentenced to 12 years in prison for his crimes against Amanda, Lisa, and the other women who testified against him. But the sentence felt inadequate, given the scope of psychological damage he had caused. Amanda and Lisa both had to relocate to different cities and undergo extensive therapy to recover from their experiences with Jake. Both told me that the hardest part of recovery was learning to trust their own judgment again after being so thoroughly manipulated. The case led to changes in stalking laws in Washington, Oregon, and California, specifically addressing the kind of systematic psychological manipulation that Jake had used against his victims. Law enforcement agencies now receive training on recognizing patterns of predatory behavior that go beyond traditional definitions of domestic abuse. But perhaps the most important outcome of this case was the network of support that Amanda, Lisa, and Jake's other victims created for each other. They formed a foundation that provides resources for people who have experienced psychological manipulation and helps them recognize the warning signs of predatory behavior. When I last spoke with Amanda, she told me that sharing her story was part of her healing process. She wanted other people to understand that predators like Jake Morrison aren't obvious monsters. They're skilled manipulators who can fool intelligent, successful people by exploiting basic human needs for love and connection.
This case taught me that infidelity and psychological predation aren't the same thing. Jake Morrison wasn't cheating on his girlfriends. He was systematically destroying human beings for his own gratification. The fact that he maintained multiple relationships simultaneously was just one tool in a much larger arsenal of abuse. What haunts me most about this case is how many victims Jake might have claimed if Amanda and Lisa hadn't discovered each other. His pattern of abuse was escalating, his methods were becoming more sophisticated, and his ability to avoid consequences was improving with each victim. It makes you realize that there are people walking among us who view relationships not as connections between equals, but as opportunities to exercise power over others. Recognizing these predators before they can cause damage is one of the most important skills any of us can develop. 3 stories, 3 different types of betrayal, but all sharing common elements that I think are important for all of us to understand. Whether it was David Chen's elaborate double life,
Michael Harrison and Elena Vasquez's deadly conspiracy, or Jake Morrison's systematic predation, each case shows us that betrayal is rarely just about broken promises or violated trust. These stories reveal something darker about human nature, the capacity some people have to view others not as fellow human beings deserving of honesty and respect, but as resources to be exploited for personal gain. David Chen saw his wives not as partners but as components in separate lives he was constructing for his own gratification. Michael Harrison and Elena Vasquez saw their congregation not as a community they were called to serve, but as a source of money and cover for their crimes. Jake Morrison saw the women he targeted not as potential partners but as victims to be systematically broken down and controlled. In each case, the perpetrators were skilled at maintaining facades of normalcy while destroying the lives of people who trusted them. They were able to exploit basic human needs for love, for faith, for connection, and turn those needs into weapons against their victims. But these cases also show us the importance of paying attention to our instincts, asking questions when things don't add up, and supporting each other when we suspect something is wrong. Sarah Chen's decision to investigate, rather than immediately confront, saved her from years of continued deception. Dorothy McKenzie's refusal to ignore financial irregularities exposed crimes that might otherwise have gone undetected. Amanda Foster and Lisa Park's decision to compare their experiences revealed a predator who might have continued victimizing others